I just had also a question on WIPO as a model with a number of member states, corporations and civil society negotiating complex treaties around intellectual property. They say on their website their challenge is to negotiate the changes and new rules needed to ensure that the international IP system keeps pace with the changing world, continues to serve its fundamental purpose of encouraging innovation, creativity, etc. And then they go on to say that the decision-making and negotiating bodies are committed to transparency and inclusiveness. All meeting documents are available online. You can also freely follow discussions in our assemblies and committees via our live webcasting service or access videos of past sessions. Now they claim, of course, they're a policy creating organisation. Is that a good model for transparency that could be considered for future trade deals? Standing committees working together on policy where these things are open and transparent?
Different multilateral organisations have got different, ways of working. So if I put it in a trade context, the WTO, when we're doing trade negotiations in the WTO, similarly documents that are produced by the chair, if you like, are public documents. So, common documents are publicly available, as opposed to specific sort of proposals from particular countries, unless they themselves make them public. So, the multilateral negotiations by definition have a different sort of operating.
Would you call that a multilateral negotiation though?
Absolutely.
With 188 member states? Yeah.
Yeah.
But isn't something like TPP a multilateral negotiation?
No.
What would you call that then?
Plurilateral.
Plurilateral, okay.
Yeah.
So could you explain the difference for those who might be?
Plurilateral means more than bilateral, but less than multilateral.
Lots of countries, but not a shipload.
Okay, so the system that they use, which is allow them to conduct 3 complex treaties, wouldn't be applicable to a 12-country. Well, what about TISA then? What is that? Is that a multilateral or plurilateral?
It's a plurilateral as well. It's up to the parties how they think. What process will best serve the objectives of the negotiation.
And what would the objectives for the negotiation be in something like TISA or TPP? To get the best outcome for each country would be looking for the best outcome in their national interest.
Yeah, that's right.
And how would that be different to WIPO? Is it more about the actual? Well,
it's not a market access kind of negotiation. It's a global rules setting exercise.
But it's just a matter of interest though, and how much would TISA be about market access? I know there's some in the TPP, but
yeah, the TISA is about services trade. So another word for that is market access. It's the terms on which foreign-owned companies can participate in foreign markets. So Australia services companies operate in other markets. It's about ensuring that they have good access to those markets and are treated fairly relative to domestic as well as other foreign companies.
So would it be feasible to have the level of transparency in something like the TPP?
Well, that's not what the parties have.
I understand
decided,
that, but is there any reason we couldn't have open and transparent negotiations?
Well, I think it's.
Look, to be honest, in the Senate inquiry recently, we had people like stakeholders like the Australian Industry Group saying that there was a lack of interest from their members in CAFTA and the China deal. They were very scathing of those 2 deals, partly because of the way the process is negotiated. They didn't feel engaged. They didn't know enough about it. So it's not just civil society talking about the lack of transparency around these negotiations. The business groups themselves are saying it's an issue. And of course, this committee is looking at how we might do things differently. But I'm just interested in why there needs to be this level of secrecy. I get asked the question all the time, and it's difficult to answer.
Well, I think one of the basic... Well, there's lots of things in what you just said. With respect to Australian industry groups' participation, or stakeholder groups more broadly, in our negotiations, as we've said, every time we have this conversation, of course there is a lot of dialogue and interaction that goes on. I mean, hundreds of meetings and, well, thousands in the case of TPP, meetings and discussions, some public, most private, because, there is a level of commercial, commerciality in some of these issues that companies don't want to talk about publicly. What are their future export plans, their growth expectations of particular products and particular markets, their sensitivities, their sort of weaknesses, where they would like any access to have transition times to facilitate adjustment. So a lot of those sorts of issues are commercially sensitive. People don't want to have them in public debate. So there's a lot of dialogue that goes on. That's the first point. With AI, different groups have got different interests. So if you look at the statements on the record from exporting interests, I think you'd have to admit that on Japan and Korea agreements, there's a long list of extremely positive, welcoming statements. Now, some groups that represent more import competing businesses, of course, do have a different perspective. They see that in some cases the reduction of our 5% tariff, and Australia goes into all of its negotiations with the intent to eliminate all of our tariffs. That's what we do, because we believe it's good for the Australian economy to reduce taxes on those consumer imports and inputs. So it's just a question of which ones you need sort of transition periods for. But nevertheless, if companies that are facing increased international competition in their areas do have a different perspective than others. So, AIG does represent a different set of constituents to some of the other groups. So, of course, they have a different kind of take on it.
Thank you. Just in relation to what you suggested there about commercial in confidence, does that suggest, given obviously there's also interest, there's also matters of public interest in these negotiations, given that the breadth and complexity of these deals, something like the TPP with 29 chapters, does it suggest that the balance is in favour of commercial interests if you can't disclose these documents?
Once again, you've raised a lot of points. There are, of course, a lot of matters of public policy importance that are dealt with in these negotiations. I mean, of course. So the way that government operates is, all of the different policy departments of government participate in negotiations, participate in defining mandates, participate in working out what we want and what we don't want. So that comes together in a cabinet mandate. It's informed by, stakeholder views, public debate. All of that comes in through the way that government makes policy across the board. So then to sort of compare issues like intellectual property policy issues with market access, when we talk about business engagement on specifics, we're normally talking about tariff issues or services issues. So, that it doesn't, it's not one or the other.
Last question, but just as a matter of interest, I mean, on that point, obviously the Harper Review has made a suggestion that intellectual property issues should be dealt with outside of these kind of trade forums because it's a matter of public interest and it shouldn't be negotiated in bilateral or multilateral deals. It's too important. Just you know, I've only got one question left.
I'll just
otherwise,
say,
yeah.
I mean, you know, intellectual property has been part of trade agreements since the Uruguay round, you know, in the early 90s. To say that one particular area should be taken out and sort of analysed on its own is in contrast to the fact, doesn't sit easily with the fact that these are overall deals. I mean, that's the reason that there's such a fight in the US Congress to get TPA, because if every country takes a negotiated agreement back to its parliament and then the parliament or the stakeholder or the public say, oh yeah, we like all of it but not that bit, so can we have the agreement minus that bit, and everybody has a different bit they want to take out, of course there's no agreement. So, you know, analysing one bit and saying, oh, yes, we don't really like that, doesn't work.
Yeah, well, I think people want to unpick it because they don't think it has worked.
Well,
that's my view. But just last question.